Hi there, Marian here for Do Tell Church. I am bringing you lesson 3 in our week-long segment of reading music. Today we're going to talk about reading notes on the lines and spaces of the staff. So this lesson on notes is going to regard to reading them as pitches. So let's get started. The first thing we need to discuss is what a note looks like when it is in a line or in a space. These notes you see are in spaces. We have whole notes on this page. The oval note head fits in between the lines so that none of that note goes past the line. We don't want any of our note head to bleed over into another space. That can be really hard to read because then you're not sure if it was on the line, in the space, or in the other space. So we need to be very clear that our notes, when they are in the spaces, just fit between two lines and do not bleed over. So here you see we have a note in each space. We have one in the bottom line space, which is space 1. We have one in the middle, which is space 2. We have another in space 3, and one in the top, space 4. So in turn, when we put our notes on lines, we want the line to cut the note in half. So you'll see that each of the lines of the staff cuts the oval note head right in half, kind of like you were going to slice a hard-boiled egg. So you want to make sure, again, that we are not drawing overly sized note heads. Because if you make them too large, then it's going to be confusing to whether it is on that line or possibly in one of the spaces. So in our example here, we have a note on line 1, one on line 2, one on line 3, one on line 4, and one at the very top on line 5. So we're going to get into reading these notes as pitches. So we're going to start in everyone's favorite place, which is treble clef land. So at the front, you see our treble clef. That reminds us that the curl of the clef tells us that the second line is G, because remember, this is sometimes called the G clef. We like to use phrases to help us remember the lines and spaces for our treble and bass clef staffs. The one that everyone seems to know are the ones for the treble clef. Our lines, we can use the phrase, every good boy does fine. And that can help you remember from line 1 up to line 5, the letter name for each of those. So you'll see that I have drawn notes in front of each of the words on the staff. So you'll see that the line cuts my oval in half. So the first one on line 1 is an E, on line 2 is a G, on line 3 is a B, on line 4 is a D, and up there on line 5 is F. So maybe phrases aren't your favorite thing to remember, but we can always remember the word face. So the word space has ace in it, and so does face. So remember, they share most of the same word. So your treble clef, your spaces spell face. F is down there in space 1. A is in space 2. C is in space 3. And E is up top in space number 4. So if you play a flute or a clarinet, a trumpet, a violin, these are the letters you need to memorize in order to read the music on your staff. If you're going to play maybe a tuba or a trombone or a baritone and bass clef, these are the letters you are going to need. So we've got a G at the bottom, a B on line 2, D on line 3. As we discussed in a previous lesson, line 4 is F. Remember, we've got 2 dots surrounding it and a big knob on the front of our clef that reminds us this is an F. And line 5 at the top is A. I've heard a lot of phrases for the lines of the bass clef. Many people like to use good boys do fine always. I find that a little too similar to every good boy does fine, and that can be a little bit confusing when it comes to remembering them. So the one I'm going to teach you today is Great Big Dragons Fly Around. There's plenty of other options for remembering the lines of the bass clef, but that's just a fun one that we can use. So in turn, this is my favorite one because I taught a family on a farm. And it's true, all of the cows did eat grass, but they also ate hay, and there's no H in the musical alphabet. So these are your bass clef notes as they relate to the spaces. So space number 1 is A for all. Space 2 is C for cows. Space 3 is E for eat. And your last space, space 4, is G for grass. So for the treble clef, we had every good boy does fine and face. For the bass clef, we had great big dragons fly around and all cows eat grass. So remember, the phrases are either 5 words for 5 lines or 4 words or 4 letters for 4 spaces. Now, I had mentioned back in lesson 1 that there are other clefs, and up on the screen we have a picture of 2 of them. Our other clefs suggest that other lines have specific names. These 2 clefs look almost identical, just one is up one line than the other. And the center of this is showing us where C is now located. So if you think about this in more of a relation to the bass clef, it makes a little bit more sense. In bass clef, space 2 is C. If you look at that alto clef, it is now using the point of its clef to tell you that C is now on line 3. So everything has just moved up one line or space. If you tried to relate that to your treble clef, you'd be moving everything down. So it just depends on which way you want to read it. The tenor clef moves C all the way up to line 4, so it's a pretty big shift. But you'll see at the bottom, these are not common clefs. There are only a few instruments that get to use these. The alto clef is used primarily for the viola and apparently the alto trombone. Who knew? I did not know that one. So I did learn something making this presentation for you today. The tenor clef is mainly used for bass clef instruments when they need to read higher. So instead of putting them into crazy ledger lines or making them switch into treble clef where they would be reading really low still, what they do is they use the tenor clef. So they'll go from bass clef and then switch to tenor clef. And instruments that do that are the cello, the bassoon. That fun word there is a euphonium. It's sort of like a baritone. Then we have the double bass, the big tall one you stand to play, and the trombone. So don't worry, unless you're playing something really crazy, you're probably not going to see one of those anytime soon. So we're going to start with a little bit of practice. So we are going to start with the treble clef. So up on your screen, again, is a poorly scanned copy because it's about 10 years old. And it simply asks you to write the letter names under each whole note. So if you have a piece of paper handy, go ahead and write what you think they are. Remember, the spaces spell face, and your lines are every good boy does fine. So take a couple seconds, see if you can fill that in, and then we'll go through the answer together. All right, let's see how you did. So this example started out by reminding you that your first note there is A. So let's see. There we go. So our first note is A. Your next note was on line 3, that is B. Your next note was in space 3, which is C. Your next note is line 2, which is G. Then line 1 was E. Space 1 was F. Line 2 was G, space 3 was C, line 4 was D, space 4 was E, line 5 was F, and we're back to line 3 as B. And for our third time, we have seen our C in space 3. So I hope that went well for you. If not, go back, rewatch the video, write down your phrases, and then come back and try the practice example again. So let's switch clefs. Let's switch to bass clef. This example features a tie. So we talked about this in lesson 2. So you only need to write that letter once. I understand there is one letter on here that you won't know, but if you think logically about the alphabet, you might be able to figure it out. So let's take a few seconds and see if you can write in the letter names for each of these notes. This is bass clef. All cows eat grass are your spaces. Great big dragons fly around is what you're going to use for your lines. All right, let's see how we did with our bass clef. So your very first note is in space 3, all cows eat. So that is an E. Our next note is a D on line 3, C on space 2, B on line 2, A in space 1. The next one is hanging out below the staff, and we haven't talked about those yet. We'll do that in another lesson. That is an F. Since your next note was a G, alphabetically F becomes G, comes before G. So you might have been able to figure that one out. So after the F below the staff, we had G on line 1, A in space 1, B on line 2, C in space 2, D on line 3, and we finished with the same note we started, E in space number 3. So what we're going to do now is we're going to read music like a piano player. So clearly you can recognize this little song. It's This Little Light of Mine. If you watched lesson 1, you can see that we are reading our grand staff. We have a treble clef on top and a bass clef on bottom. We know we need to play them together because we have a brace at the beginning of the lines of music. After each of our clefs, we don't see any sharps or flats. That tells me we are in the key of C. And we have a time signature, which is 4/4 time. So today we are just worried about writing in the pitches of these notes. So go ahead and take a moment and see if you can fill in the letter names for the treble clef and the letter names for the bass clef. I know a few of those are stacked as we would play 2 notes at the same time on the piano. You can write the higher pitch on top and the lower pitch on bottom. So go ahead and take about a minute and let's see if you can fill in the pitch names for This Little Light of Mine. All right, let's see how you did. We're going to start by going through our treble clef on the top line first. So you should have had a G and then 3 more Gs. So we've got 4 Gs because we have 4 pitches up on line 2. Our next note at the end of that measure is an E on line 1. The next one you may not have known. This is middle C, and that's what it looks like. Again, we'll talk about that in another lesson. And that is C. So you're going to see that our third measure looks identical to our first measure. So again, we had 4 Gs followed by an E. If you look at your bottom line, here's that middle C again. So if you didn't know it, that's okay. We haven't talked about it yet. In the second measure on the bottom, we have 4 Cs up in space 3, an A in space 2, and the end of that line is an F in space number 1. So let's go through our bass clef to see how well you did. The very first note is C. Next, we have something that we have in pianos where we play 2 notes at the same time. The top note there is a G in space 4, and the lower note is E in space 3. If you go to measure 2, we have C in space 2, then we have a single G up in space 4, followed by an E in space 3, and then just like we did with the treble clef, we see that we have the same thing for our bass clef in the third measure as we did for the first measure. We have a C, then a G, and an E. To finish it out, if you look at the second line, we have a C, then we have a G in space 4, an E in space 3. We finally have a different note. We have F. This F is on line number 4. Then we have another 2-note combo. The top note is an A on line 5 with an F on line 4 on bottom. Then we finish our last measure with a C in space 2, an A on line 5, and an F on line 4. Well, I hope that you did well with our examples today. Remember, you can always go back and watch the video again so that you can better understand the concepts, especially after we do the examples. Sometimes it's good to go back and go, oh, that's what she meant. If you ever want more exercises to do on your own to practice reading music, just let me know. I've been teaching for a very long time. I have a lot of material that I could share with you if you were interested in practicing on your own. Well, thank you for joining me today. I hope that you all have a great rest of your day.